I'm Tiffany Watt Smith and I'm a historian of emotions. Welcome to my exp. What interests me about trust is its emotional aspects. You know, we live in a world that is so complex that it can't really be understood purely rationally. We can't make rational assessments of everything that we have to trust. And so trust, then when we think about what trust feels like as an emotion, I think trust feels quite dangerous. You know, I think it feels very vulnerable and it feels exposing. The thing that's interesting about trust is that we don't notice trust most of the time. You know, we come into a room together, we trust that no one's going to pull out a gun and shoot us, we trust that the building we're in isn't going to collapse. Trust is what happens when we run out of information and evidence and knowledge. Trust is a sort of leap into the unknown, and it's when we become aware that we're trusting and needing to trust that it becomes a kind of more emotional territory, and it becomes about vulnerability and uncertainty and fear. I think the greatest misconception about trust is that it's a rational, cognitive appraisal of a situation. You know, I think the reality of trust is that it's deeply emotional response. And some of those emotions are quite uncomfortable ones. I think it can feel very anxious and vulnerable and nerve-wracking to trust someone. And I think understanding that is very important. The historian Uta Frevert argues that the meaning and definition of trust changed between the 18th and 19th century. So in the 18th century, if you looked up trust in an encyclopedia, what you would find is people talking about trusting in God. That was the context in which the word trust was used. But by the 19th century, as cities expanded, as people were encountering a lot more strangers, as industrial processes were beginning to fragment, so in order to make something you had to rely on people from all different kinds of businesses and backgrounds and so on. So they stopped talking about trusting God and they start talking about trusting people. And that's a very significant transition. And it makes us really aware of this kind of twin history of trust and the city. So as people are living in these very overcrowded and busy cities, and as they're encountering a lot of people from different backgrounds and different cultures and different walks of life, people who might not necessarily be easily held to account, people who we can't necessarily rely on to do the things they're going to say they're going to do, then this is where trust becomes necessary. So trust isn't this atmosphere that we wade into, and it's not something even that we instinctively have for other people. Trust is something that we have to build, and we have to build it together. And of course, the ways we build trust have differed across time and certainly do differ across different cultures. And this is, you know, an important very important topic for international, multinational businesses to grapple with. You know, how do we build trust in these different contexts with people whose ideas and expectations of how a trusting relationship develops may be dramatically different. Western theorists tend to talk about trust in terms of building evidence. So we build evidence that someone is going to do the thing they say they're going to do, and that over time allows us to feel a sense that we can rely on them and we can take them at their word. So the recent World Happiness Report suggests there's been a dramatic dip in trust even in the last few years since the pandemic. And it's very hard, isn't it, to know exactly what we mean when we talk about that. It's not the first time that people have spoken about living in a crisis of trust, but the idea that we might be living in such an age might be really evidence of a kind of hankering after a time where trust is sort of not necessary, where everyone is compliant, where people are always well-meaning and have your best interests at heart, where trust is never broken. But that's not the world we live in. And I think trust always is going to feel like a challenging emotion. Anthropologists looking at trust, different kinds of trust cultures, point out that this idea of evidence is not universal. One description that I personally found very fascinating was a description of building trust in Korea. So the anthropologists described a Korean concept called maum. Maum describes a kind of atmosphere of mutual benevolence and care. The Koreans say you give maum and you take maum. So the anthropologist described how you would build trust in this kind of context. Trust is built off the exchange, so the giving and the receiving of small acts of care. So an act of care might be a physical gift or a present of some kind, or it might be a gesture that shows that you're thinking about someone or you have concern for their well-being. It might be something as small as opening the door for someone, or as large as showing up when they have a family emergency. But over time, by giving and receiving these acts of care, you can create this atmosphere of maum, or we-ness, togetherness, I think, that then allows for a trusting relationship to flourish. So that's quite different, I think, from the perception that we gather information and evidence about someone's behaviour and then make a rational assessment of whether or not we trust them. This idea is that trust is something that we develop over a long period of time through sensitively feeling that the other person has our interests at heart and cares about us. A very different kind of approach to the idea of trust, and very important that we understand those differences.